Welcome to the Tullock Lecture here at the George Mason University Law School Information Economy Project, and we are especially honored today to have as our Tullock Lecture, which brings big ideas about information from distinguished speakers from around the world coming here to Arlington, Virginia. We're especially honored to have Clayton Powell III, who is based here now in Washington, D.C., and he coordinates for the University of Southern California various and sundry research projects at a very high level involving technology and information, and they range broadly in scope, everything from cultural diplomacy to human trafficking. Before his move to Washington in 2010, he was the University of Southern California's Vice Provost for Globalization, and he's taught and had many interesting and high-level positions, I know, at USC. But his background, of course, cuts a very wide swath through American media over the last several decades. He started out at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was a student of the late great Ithiel de Sola Poole in the political science department, and he has been involved in mass media technology for many years, vice president of technology for the Freedom Forum, and before that an executive producer at Quincy Jones Productions, where he flew around the world doing exciting things. He was at NPR. He apparently was the morning shock jock at MIT. Shock jock at MIT. Something's wrong with that sentence. On the MIT radio station, and Michael Marcus used to tune him in mornings when he was a student there a few semesters back. Adam Powell has written extensively about technology, media, and international issues for publications ranging from the New York Times and Wired to the Online Journalism Review. In 1999, he won the World Technology Award for Media and Journalism, sponsored by The Economist, and the Overseas Press Club Award for International Reporting for a series of broadcasts he produced in Iran. So we couldn't have a richer set of experiences to learn about, we hope, today from our speaker. He only has an hour and a half to share them with us, but we'll hear from our distinguished speaker, and hopefully we'll have a little time for Q&A, and then we will have at about 5:30 time to adjourn to the foyer here, and which we call the Levy Atrium, and we have a little reception planned there, and I hope you can all join us for that. Without further ado, Clayton Powell III.
Thank you, Tom. It is a little unsettling to discover that you can walk into a room and someone will introduce himself as one of your listeners from the MIT radio station. I hope that his memories aren't as clear as they might be. Well, thanks, Tom, and thank you to all of you. Many familiar faces, many unfamiliar. Tom's invitation letter said that this should be about big ideas and information, and it should deal with the intersection of economics, technology, and public policy. So here are a few thoughts about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to publish, access to information, and how they may be changing faster and in more ways than we realize. First, some ground rules. This is going to be a PowerPoint-free zone. I'll make up some PowerPoint slides if you want and email them to you. But too often people talk to PowerPoint rather than to their stated point. Second ground rule is that, as Dan Gilmore liked to say, he says, "My readers know more than I do." And looking around the room, I know that for certain that you know more than I do collectively, and in a couple of cases, definitely individually. So I look forward to your corrections, rebuttals, and amplifications a little later, and perhaps even more corrections, rebuttals, and amplifications over libations downstairs. CBS News commentator and analyst Eric Severide once began a program by saying, "Everything you are about to hear actually happened." A wonderful way to start a documentary or a news program. He was introducing a documentary about the Army McCarthy hearings in the early 1950s. And when he was hosting this program, which was less than 20 years later, about 15 years later, it already seemed like something out of another era. And so he felt he had to begin by saying that it was actually real. Well, once again, everything that I'm about to say is real, is based on unclassified public information, and I can send you sites on any item that you'd like. Also, as a recovering journalist, I couldn't resist updating it even this morning based on this morning's New York Times, but we'll get to that shortly. As Tom said, I've had I like that sundry, varied and sundry background, but part of it is having been fortunate enough to actually run something I never would have expected, a U.S. National Science Foundation Engineering Research Center, a U.S. national laboratory, in this case one devoted to multimedia. It is the NSF ERC for multimedia. It graduated, which you're supposed to do after 10 years, 11 in our case. We were slow learners maybe. That meant we got more funding that 11th year, but we're not supposed to talk about that. And nothing we did was classified. Everything was public, or at least it was published in academic journals. We spun off a lab called CREATE, the Center for Risk Evaluation and Threat Analysis, which was funded entirely by Homeland Security, its first laboratory, also on the USC campus. I make it a point not to go into CREATE so I don't have to remember what's classified and what's not. We work closely, I see Jeff Cowan here, work closely with ISI, which is an extremely large laboratory at USC in Los Angeles, with a Washington laboratory a few blocks down the street here. And I know that part of the lab here, where I had an office for a time, they do classified work, and I made it a point never to walk into that part of the lab because, again, in my failing memory, I might accidentally fold in something that's classified, even though I had a security clearance. But anyway, to history. The internet and social media were conceived and greeted as significant steps for advancing freedom of expression and increased access to information. Suddenly, it seems, anyone with access to a computer, or now to a cell phone, is a global publisher and a personal curator of the largest public library ever created, dwarfing in sheer volume the great libraries of Alexandria, Timbuktu, or even the Library of Congress. All of this may be true, but what these advances may obscure is that at their very core, there are serious difficulties that threaten freedom of expression and access to information. The most crude and best known measures are those imposed by governments from China to Iran, which use basically brute force to block websites and other information that does not meet with government approval. It's not an iron curtain, but it is, as President Obama said earlier today, an electronic curtain. If you were in Tunisia before Arab Spring, you discovered that the internet sites that you were getting on your computer or your cell phone in Tunisia sometimes were slightly different from internet sites that you would get elsewhere in the world. For example, if you conducted research on human rights in Tunisia, and you were in Tunisia, you'd be redirected to government-run servers masquerading as such organizations as Human Rights Watch, where you might have been surprised to learn, human rights were in pretty good shape in Tunisia. They were honored, valued by that country's dictatorship, and that really the people there were all very happy. You could actually get to this Tunisian server from outside, as we did from the first museum down the street, Museum 1.0, and we showed some of the Tunisian websites, much to the chagrin of people from Human Rights Watch who were in the audience. But what if the internet can also prevent or inhibit free speech? Again, an example from the museum when it was down the street. It opened in 1997. It was devoted to free press, free speech, and free spirit, in that order. And free spirit, I think, had something to do with the generous lunches and dinners. But we used to do programs about global freedom of expression. The internet had reached a state around the world where people were discovering in countries throughout the world that there was this new thing, the internet. And so we conducted forums and educational programs in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Eastern and Central Europe, and am I leaving out Australia, Antarctica? And in most cases, this is the late 1990s, mid to late 1990s, the internet was fairly new. We invited some of the people who were key speakers at these events around the world to come to the museum for programs. And one of them was someone you may know, Atrium, a well-known lawyer in the UK who was born in Turkey. He came to the museum. We had some conversations about what he wanted to say about the conditions in Turkey. And in introducing the program, I mentioned that, as with all programs at the museum, public programs, it was being streamed live on museum radio, early internet radio service. So when he came to the podium, he did this. I said, "Are you all right? Do you need some water?" "No." I said, "Well, can you talk about conditions in Turkey?" "No." "Why not?" He said, "My parents are in Turkey. There is a judge there who knows who they are. If anyone in Turkey hears what I'm saying, they will arrest my parents." So there was the internet, this wonderful tool for free speech, reaching into a forum on free speech just down the street here in Arlington, preventing a speaker from discussing free speech. That was a bit of a revelation, because suddenly, you know, wait a minute, does this mean that we have to speak about free speech in private? We can't speak about it in public. Well, that was over a decade ago. Where have we gone and where are we today? For an answer, I always like to look at laboratories. Labs are always clues to the future. I always like to hang out in labs. So, as Tom said, I was a student at MIT in the 1960s, which is the candy store of laboratories. It was, to get to the radio station every night, I had to pass the instrumentation laboratory. Nice opaque name. Yes, you know what it is. It's an industrial-looking building on Memorial Drive, which just happens to be where inertial navigation was invented in the 1940s. The inertial navigation is what guides missiles. It's what guided the Apollo spacecraft to the moon, and 4 or 5 of them are in each flight deck of the 747. The Poseidon missile guidance system enabled to be launched from a submarine onto the water, pop up out of the water, the missile would fire its main engines, and would fly thousands of miles and land on a target within 100 meters of where it was aimed. That was quite remarkable. That is quite remarkable. Basically the same system, the Poseidon guidance system, slightly changed, flew on the Apollo spacecraft. And basically that same system, very slightly changed, is on board 747s. In fact, when Boeing first proposed using these on Boeing 747s, when they first came out in the 1960s, there was and you can look this up, there was considerable discussion that Boeing 747s could only be sold to NATO countries because they contained classified devices. That quickly fell to the wayside as countries that were not part of NATO wanted to order many of them, and Boeing wanted to sell many of them. If there was bad weather, I would get to the radio station by going through the tunnels under MIT, which are all linked. And there was a funny, strange little symbol on a door that I saw one night. So, what can they do to me? I knocked on the door. Grad student opened the door and said, "Yes." I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Come in." I discovered you could knock on lab doors. It may not be the case anymore, but at least then you could knock on lab doors, and people were only too happy to tell you what they were doing. And that strange symbol was something which they had just designed to alert people that they might be firing this new thing called a maser. And he showed me how it could punch a hole in a piece of aluminum foil, which I didn't believe. I said, "Oh, what's the trick?" He said, "No trick, it's coherent energy." "Yeah, right." In building 50, which was about 100 yards from the radio station, there were these unconventional psychocognition experiments. And if you're wondering what that is, I see another smile from our friend from NSF. That's because the US heard the Soviets were doing it, so we had to do it too. Think of the men who stare at goats. And then at Tech Square, right around the corner, there were a bunch of grad students who prided themselves on being anarchists who were working on something called packet switching. The idea that you could break up a message into little packets and you could send the packets all over some network and they would all be collected. And it sounded like the most Rube Goldberg device I've ever heard. But of course, that became the ARPANET and then the internet. And I'm convinced that inventors leave in their inventions some of their personalities. So I think some of those anarchist personalities are embedded in the internet. Let's move forward to the late 1960s and early 70s at Stanford University. And there was an exploration of pseudo-color analysis. This is something which is not widely known, and certainly at the time was deliberately not talked about. The ability to look at a black and white photograph and extract easily information and images that were not visible to the naked eye. Very useful if you're looking at aerial photographs of battlefields in Vietnam and you're wondering where those North Vietnamese tanks are. They're hidden under the trees. Well, with pseudo-color analysis, they're not hidden under the trees. They show up as bright magenta. I think that was unclassified even then. It just wasn't talked about very widely. Also, it involved huge amounts of computer power. There were the number of computers in the world that could process this could be counted on your fingers and toes, probably only on your fingers. And Stanford had one of them. That power, by the way, is now on your cell phone. In the 1980s, I had some friends at Sarnoff Labs and started hanging out there. And you think of Sarnoff Labs, you think of RCA, NBC, color television. That's true. They also were working on an interesting government contract for something called subtraction technology. Subtraction technology was the goal, and what it finally did, was the ability to take a live television broadcast or a live video feed and in real time, 30 frames a second, remove objects or people from the image and replace them with something or someone else. Why did the government want to do this? I have no idea. It, of course, became a commercial product in the 1990s, and if you watch sports events, that is what is now used as a rack-mounted device to generate those advertisements on the walls of sports stadiums. It removes what is physically there in the image and replaces it with an advertisement. And it is good enough that, of course, players' shadows will appear on it, players can run in front of it. It's all easily done, and that's actually a relatively trivial use of the technology because it's much more powerful than that. IMSC, I'm a spin-off Create. The IMSC lab, which I ran, the Integrated Media Systems Center, another opaque name. We're convinced that the founder of IMSC, who's now the president of the University of Southern California, that he deliberately picked such an opaque name because he wanted it as a naming opportunity. So that if I were willing to give a mayor, I thought I'd say Jeff Cowan, willing to give a mayor $20 million, it would be the Cowan Laboratory. But it is and remains IMSC. We did have a naming gift on the line at one point, but then the person who was about to make the gift apologized that he had a relative who was seriously interested in horse racing and wanted to buy a lot of horses instead. So, such is the life of universities and research. Our spin-off lab, Create, I know many of you have gone through the Los Angeles airport, LAX, and years ago you used to read about LAX being shut down by people who were jumping the line, going past security. You haven't read about that much lately. Well, IMSC and Create actually developed a rather interesting, simple technique to predict what people will do as they approach security. It's the same kind of analysis which is done, those of you from LA know that the areas west and north of the University of USC are now much, much safer, much lower crime than they used to be. Part of it is because with video cameras in the neighborhoods to the west and north of the university, with the permission of LAPD, we can see how people are moving in the streets. Somebody about to snatch a purse or somebody about to break into a car, it turns out they have a unique signature. And so all you have to do is watch and wait for that signature. Now, USC's can't control, they don't carry guns. They do ride on segways though, so they can get places quickly. So they ride out and they say, "You look lost, can we help you?" And people leave. Now, as the police commissioner in Los Angeles likes to say, we know you're not stopping crime, you're moving crime. But that's good enough for the moment. Jeff Cowan knows about the work in human trafficking, which is extraordinarily interesting and effective and can't be discussed in great detail. Suffice it to say, it's something similar, except we're watching human behavior in how do terrorists behave, how do human traffickers behave, how do people about to snatch a purse behave. There are unique types of behavior which you can now track digitally as well as optically. And it's turned out to be a very interesting project. Let me finish with one little-known technology which is actually becoming quite interesting commercially, which is out of IMSC. It's location-based data fusion, meaning, let's say that if I had my laptop out and connected to the lab, I could put in an address, 3301 North Fairfax Drive, Arlington, Virginia. And within the matter of the prototype, it took a couple of hours. It's certainly under an hour, and probably now it's down to about the order of 10 minutes, meaning about 15 minutes. The software will generate, just from the address, a wireframe model of this neighborhood, which it will do using publicly available civilian satellite imagery. It costs about $100 a shot, so you need to have your credit card out. It then begins to populate that wireframe model of the neighborhood with video. Where is it getting the video? It's getting the video. We'll get to that later. It also populates the wireframe model with data. So it builds a model of this building from satellite information. It'll begin to go into the internet, dig down, and see everything that is related to this GIS location and this street address. And you can then query it. Has there ever been any police activity at this address? Has there ever been any fire department activity at this address? What are the telephone numbers at this address? Is there anybody named Smith who has used this address any time in the recent past? It's basically the world's biggest cross directory. For those of you in newsrooms, you can look at an address and it will give you all the phone numbers and people there. But this gives you everything there and organizes it neatly in displays. As I said, it also gets video. The video was an accident. The video was an afterthought. In fact, it was an accident. In fact, it was something which is still viewed by some people in the lab as a bit of a parlor trick. The video comes in because the software is looking for everything about this location. Well, to start with, I'm sure George Mason has security cameras. How do the security cameras send their video to command centers? Well, the cheap way to do it is via the internet. I don't see one in here either, but there's one in the hall. The cheap way to do it is by the internet. Well, of course, but how would anybody ever able to intercept that video? How would anybody ever able to see it? The answer is the camera has an IP address. The IP address is associated with this street address. And so we discovered, our software was discovering video associated with street addresses and GIS locations. Not only was it discovering it, it was lighting up buildings with live 3D images of what's inside. It was like you look at the wireframe model, you have some external from the satellite imagery, some external imagery, and then it would light up as if it were translucent, and it'd be looking inside the building. When we discovered this, or actually a grad student discovered it one night doing some calibration runs. I said, please don't ever look at a government building. In fact, don't look at anything that isn't on the USC campus, and that includes dormitories. Do not be looking at dormitories. And oh, by the way, please, would somebody please alert NSF that they should start encrypting their security camera video. We demonstrated this for the National Science Foundation when they had their visit at the end of 2005, and our project manager, Bruce Kramer, said, this is really great. We actually rendered downtown Washington for him and then populated it with some live video, Pennsylvania Avenue, 14th Street. He said, this is great, this is great. Somebody on the NSF team said, isn't that the Ronald Reagan building back there? Can I ask a question? Or, how much is that worth? Cyrus, how much is it? Here comes DC Property Tax Database, $900 and whatever million. Oh. At which point Bruce said, this is great, don't do my neighborhood. So, get the idea. That was 6 years ago. Now to today. Let's take a glimpse of the power of the dark side. Maybe we need some Darth Vader music here. It was revealed last month that a hacker group called Anonymous has the power to launch an internet cyber attack which would create a major power outage. Yes, the city can be blacked out by a group of hackers, by a group of computer hackers. We'll come back to that a little later. Same month, John Markoff writing in the New York Times about the invention of a single atom transistor. That might make it possible to factor large numbers more quickly than with conventional machines, okay? Thereby undermining modern data scrambling systems. Okay, now it's getting interesting. That are the basis of electronic commerce and data privacy. Oh, got it. Hackers, single atom transistor, end of electronic commerce. But in any event, we'll be getting there in a moment. Just as new weapons of war always seem to be developed and used somewhere or other, we now see that new digital tools will be developed that will threaten to disrupt global economy and more. Let's look at drones as an interesting analogy in the world of atoms instead of the world of bits. Drones are basically model airplanes. Some of them are pretty big, some of them are very large airplanes, not large compared to a 747, but they're basically small airplanes, and they are cheap. The U.S. has set an interesting precedent, as explained by Attorney General Holder this week, that a head of state, in this case President Obama, can decide on individuals who are dangerous to the United States and can order them killed by drones. Holder said, it may not always be feasible to capture a U.S. citizen terrorist who presents an imminent threat of violent attack, to which the New York Times added in its story, significantly, Mr. Holder did not say that such a situation is the only kind in which it would be lawful to kill a citizen. Rather, he said it would be lawful at least under those circumstances. Consider what that means. Even without drones, for some months now, in Iran, someone, maybe Israel, maybe the U.S., has been killing scientists working on Iran's nuclear program. And using the internet and a really clever piece of software, Stuxnet virus, someone, Israel, maybe the U.S., has been using software attacks to destroy equipment, centrifuges in Iran's nuclear laboratories. It went undetected for a long time until some people in Europe saw it sort of running across the internet and said, wow, this is really neat. What is it? And the meowing you heard was the cat coming out of the bag. Iran is blaming its enemies, Israel, maybe the US, for somehow causing a large explosion in one of its facilities, killing and injuring many. We don't know if that explosion was indeed an attack, as Iran claims, or an accident, but the use of drones, the internet, and old-fashioned explosives placed under scientists' cars are all to the targeted people and governments' attacks. All of this even is not entirely inconsistent with US policy. The President said on Sunday, a nuclear-armed Iran is completely counter to Israel's security interests, but it is also counter to the national security interests of the United States. Sounds like a justification for something we do not yet know what. Back to drones. So far they've been operating in places that we can't see, or at least we can't see them on CNN. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, That's today. Where will they be tomorrow, and who will be controlling them? Just to drive the point home, last week when I was in Asia, I was told that the #1 producer of drones in the world is now the People's Republic of China. We may be smart people, but we are not the only smart people in the world. We should never assume we have a monopoly on a new technology, whether drones or computer viruses. Writing in the Financial Times, Francis Fukuyama asked whether the US really wants a world where any head of state, let alone terrorists, can push a button to kill any soldier or diplomat or scientist in his or her home, office, or car. But this goes beyond military applications, far beyond police departments that are starting to use drones to observe neighborhoods. And as is so often the case, the civilian applications are so lucrative that they outrun the military technologies, even drones. And as with the internet, drones are democratizing technology. By the latest published count last month, there were over 20,000 civilian drone enthusiasts in the United States, and counting. Now that the federal government has withdrawn restrictions on drones in the US and permits their private use, we'll no doubt see them spread. Just think of it, stalking celebrities from the air for fun and profit, or just following your girlfriend down the street. They're cheap, they're easily available, some of them are small enough to fit in that briefcase, and these new technologies will give new meaning to the term helicopter parents. This is not science fiction, this is today. But that's the world of atoms. Let's go back to bits, digital technology. Turn to an everyday device we use all the time, and indeed we use it all the time, for speech. We know that from your cell phone, your physical location is tracked, and the history of locations you visit is recorded. Without your explicit approval, maybe you checked a box somewhere in one of those pop-up forms. All that information is subject to subpoena by the government, and indeed, if it is not already being recorded and stored by government agencies. We know that smartphones, iPhones and the Android phones in particular, are being directed by Apple, Google, and others to dip into your address book and your photo collections, copy them, and store them elsewhere on the internet, again without your explicit approval. Again, some pop-up menu may have come up and you may have checked a box. We now know that kill switches can be used by companies to reach into your smartphone or tablet to disable or remove software or content files. Stated purpose is to save you the inconvenience of having to update your software. You might be subject to a virus attack. And of course, to protect copyrighted material. You can see where this is going. We already have publicly available software that will hack into your smartphone from across the room. Anybody who's checking email, oh goodness, I don't think anybody checking email. Anybody who's checking email, I could, from this podium, hack into your smartphone, and without your knowledge or approval, monitor your activity and even look through your cell phone's camera lens. The hacker can be a friend, an enemy, an agent of law enforcement, although whether this requires prior approval by a judge is murky right now. And oh, by the way, once I have that information from your cell phone, I have your passwords. And that is one reason that I no longer, except for today, carry one of these. And of course, as one person in particular in the room knows, you should never carry one into China. Actually, this one has been to China, where I was advised after I arrived that even as a former lab director, I was a person of interest. So we assume this is compromised. And we know that geospatial data fusion software developed at IMSC and commercialized by at least 3 companies can locate the preponderance of devices and sensors at a given address or GIS location and coordinate them, creating a 3-dimensional live image of a room or location, not virtual reality, but what we now call augmented reality, as to say, 3-dimensional image plus all the data associated with that location. To see what is possible now and is unclassified, there are places within a short walk of where we are today where you can see commercial versions of these technologies. Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and Chevron were among the early companies that licensed it. Chevron actually paid more than anybody else. And it seemed odd, why would Chevron, an oil company, be the largest commercial industry partner of a research laboratory looking into multimedia? Well, it turned out that oil companies, such as Chevron, are among the largest users of computer power in the world. And one of the things that Chevron wanted to do was to create live three-dimensional images of offshore oil rigs. They wanted three-dimensional images of what's under the ground in Pennsylvania, oil shale. They wanted images of what's under the Gulf of Mexico. To do that requires a great deal of computer power and some very clever people. I'm not one of them. So it was only after they viewed it as a production tool that someone said, oh, gee, can this also work for our security system? Well, yes. It scaled, for Chevron, it was scaled to 200 cameras simultaneously, and for Northrop Grumman and Lockheed, which use it primarily for security, I think it's scaled to 300 or 400, maybe a order of 1,000 by now. And of course, how many know In-Q-Tel? 1, 2, 3, 4. In-Q-Tel is a short walk from here, and they are very interested in it. In-Q-Tel is the CIA's venture capital entity, and they do some really interesting work there. How do we as a free society respond to all this? We need not reach the point of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's dilemma of a moral person confronting evil, in his case, of a theologian confronted by Adolf Hitler. But you can see some of the same principles at work. From a pacifist Bonhoeffer joining the plot to kill Hitler to sending the SEALs to kill bin Laden seems to be a couple of dots that could be connected. But as a free society, what should we be encouraging? Seems to begin with freedom. This suggests centralized top-down controls are a last resort. All too often they are our first resort. Here in the US, Congress has repeatedly attempted to control content on the internet, and the Supreme Court has rejected almost all of these attempts. The White House announced it wants the power to shut down the internet when it declares an emergency. Globally, the United Nations and other international organizations find it hard to resist the temptation for regulation. Sounds like the title of a Tom Hazlett column, Temptation for Regulation. This is from an article in the Wall Street Journal. A diplomatic process will begin in Geneva. It has started already, just started. A diplomatic process will begin in Geneva that could result in a new treaty giving the United Nations unprecedented powers over the internet. Dozens of countries, including Russia and China, are pushing hard to reach this goal by year's end. As Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin said last June, his goal and that of his allies is to establish, quote, international control over the internet, close quote, through the ITU, a treaty-based organization under UN auspices. Well, we view with alarm, I think, Russia and its allies controlling the internet, just as Putin, no doubt, views with alarm an internet which is not controlled, or even worse, controlled by the US. But to understand how some of these actions, some of them well-intentioned, might harm speech, an analogy is useful. Whenever you hear the word internet, just substitute the word newspaper. It suddenly becomes, Congress wants to control the content of newspapers. The Supreme Court found that analogy compelling, and that's why the court keeps striking down attempts to limit free speech and publication online. During an emergency, the White House wants to shut down newspapers. That's beginning to sound problematic. Let's reread that last news article. A diplomatic process will begin in Geneva that could result in a new treaty giving the United Nations unprecedented powers over newspapers. Dozens of countries, including Russia and China, are pushing hard to reach this goal by year's end. As Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin said last June, his goal, and that of his allies, is to establish, quote, international control over newspapers. Beginning to see the point. So back to our question, how does a free society respond to all this? First, I would argue, is by providing individuals with options. And I said I'd come back to aerospace. A few years ago, flying from Shanghai to Singapore, I had a tight connection in Hong Kong. And due to weather delays in Hong Kong, my inbound flight from Shanghai was running later and later, and we pulled into the gate less than 15 minutes before the connecting flight was scheduled to leave. I assumed I'd missed the connection. But I kept being reassured by a Cathay Pacific flight attendant who said, Hong Kong is very efficient. So I walked up the jetway, saw several golf carts with signs, and one of them said, Powell, Singapore. It must be me. So I went over and said, are you going to the Singapore flight? Yes, Powell, I take my boarding pass. Very good. He reaches into his pocket, takes out a device, puts it up to me, he said, take off your glasses. Bleep. Thank you. What just happened? Please, have a seat in the car. So we drove through Hong Kong as departures on third level, arrivals on this level, and there's a middle layer which is secure. The golf cart goes down a little ramp through the secure area, racing to the other gate, at which point the driver said, "Your flight, right up those stairs." I said, "Oh, thank you." And there was a uniformed gentleman there who took out the back of his slacks, the device. "Yeah, take off your glasses, please." "Ah, yes, Powell." Okay, I walked up the stairs and made my flight. Even more amazing, my checked bags make the flight. So now I must assume the Chinese have my retina scan. Should they have asked for my approval? Interesting notion. Of course, that would have slowed down the service. Not very efficient. And I might have missed the flight. Last week, I had another connection through Hong Kong from Singapore to Seoul. My inbound flight was late. Passengers had tight connections. I didn't see any disclosure forms anywhere, but once again, there was the line of golf carts with different cities and names. And we all made our connections. Very efficient. By contrast, consider what happened connecting from Asia through San Francisco. No, you're way ahead of me, okay. No retina scan, no surrender of privacy other than the usual weighted immigration, and then the usual intrusive, lengthy, and clumsy TSA inspections, the result of which is I missed my connecting flight to the East Coast. Now most Americans have at least some choice. I could have surrendered some privacy and paid a fee to get faster clearance at SFO, but I chose not to. Maybe I would have made the connection, but it was my choice. The lesson here for not just governments, but for Apple, Google, and other smartphone vendors who are reaching into our telephones and taking software and content is to at least offer a choice, make it clear, offer a choice. Some may want to opt out of monitoring software, others may want to opt in, especially if it's cheaper or if there's a social network attached. So first, for a free society, the default should be informed choice. But mandating informed choice here in the US just applies here in the US. Our free society is governed by local ordinances such as the US Constitution. Our free speech is governed by the First Amendment, a local ordinance. And so how do we as a free society respond to a world, much of which is not free? One approach is to take the same approach we have for arms control, negotiation and treaties. Negotiation going on in Geneva over the internet is probably a step in the wrong direction, but we'll see. The analogy begins to fall apart because of Henry Kissinger's famous phrase, "trust but verify." It's very hard to verify what's going on with the internet and digital technologies. They're small, portable, and cheap. Remember that hacking group called Anonymous? Look at page 1 of today's New York Times. I know you have today's New York Times here, right? It's a 2-column headline or a 3-column headline below the fold. To the extent Anonymous had a leader, it was a 28-year-old man operating out of his apartment in a New York City housing project. No big laboratory, no big office, no big budget, just a guy in his apartment. This is not the world of nuclear weapons and intercontinental missiles. It's just a guy in his apartment, which is not to say we should not have negotiations and treaties, merely that we should be aware of their limitations. There will always be the guy in his apartment. Which leaves us, and I look forward to our discussion, with a few possibilities. Information. Free society must remain informed about those whose goal is to limit or end free societies. Research. A free society to remain free must remain at the forefront of technology to at least stay abreast of tools being developed by those whose goal is to limit or end free society. Vigilance. A free society to remain free must remain vigilant and maintain defenses in the digital realm, just as in traditional military methods and technologies. Cooperation. And here we have some analogies from the 20th century. Just as NATO countries cooperated in the 20th century on military research, a free society should identify those with whom it shares similar interests and work with them to advance its interests. I'll come back to that phrase, which is not mine. We're smart people. We're not the only smart people in the world. Competition. A free society has an interest in expanding freedom, or at least in limiting the threats from societies that do not share similar interests. Now, in one way or another, these are all very traditional interests. They're very traditional approaches that have worked in the world of atoms that we are just now translating into the world of bits. But the threats to the digital technologies are not just incrementally greater than in the world of atoms. What we've seen is different in nature, faster, stealthier, cheaper. Think of the guy in an apartment, but just as destructive, if not more so. We've seen that it is democratized, dispersed, and as Kevin Kelly famously described it, out of control, for good or evil. That is where technology has taken us, at the intersection of information, technology, and public policy. But to once again quote Dan Gilmore, my readers know more than I do. So I especially look forward to your comments, questions, corrections, and additions. And even more so, perhaps, at the reception. Thank you. Questions, comments?
Oh, I saw somebody about to.
Yeah, I'll be happy to ask the first. You talked about I guess President Putin's plans now for the internet through the ITU. What does he have in mind? Where might this go through the ITU to give countries like Russia more control?
Well, the benign, relatively benign model would be the traditional PTT, applying postal regulations to the internet. That's the relatively benign model. Obviously, imagine you're sitting in Russia in the 1980s and 1990s, when all internet traffic went through the United States. We're pretty unhappy about that, because even traffic between Moscow and what was that, Leningrad, would at some point show up in the United States. This is, National Security Agency's dream. Now, what more and more countries are doing is trying to build their own nationally walled gardens, so that you don't get access to the outside world easily from inside of the country. Again, that sounds like postal regulation. Think of where U.S. postal regulations of content where they began. Control of content and postal regulations. Remember, the Revolutionary War was the golden age of pamphleteers. Pamphleteers, some of them were famous, most of them were not, drove a lot of the speech that led to the creation of the United States. And postal regulations, as Jeff Howland's study made clear, what was that, 3 years ago, 4 years ago? Postal regulations actually were designed to promote free speech, to promote freedom of the press through lower postal rates for publishers. And then something happened. In the middle of the 19th century, suddenly we had content controls applied to the post office. And it was during the Civil War. Not what you're thinking. It wasn't anything military. Well, it was military. But it wasn't anything about military secrets. It was because wives and girlfriends of the soldiers on both sides of the Civil War were sending naked pictures to their boyfriends in the army. And the government didn't like that. So that's actually the beginning of content controls. The postal regulations that they date back to the Civil War. And this newfangled technology called photography. There's a wonderful line in an article that I think was just this week, where somebody said that anything was invented a long time ago is benign and is not a problem. Anything invented recently is probably threatening. So just as the internet is worrying to President Putin now, photography was something which was worrying people in the middle of the 19th century, some people. So again, using postal regulation as a model is something which keeps coming up over and over again. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. In your, I know you covered this in your studies. In all of the debate that goes on net neutrality, the impact on the mass media, where mass media is going to go. There are some people who are very concerned about changes in copyright law.
This is the Mike Wallace question. Some people say.
Yeah. I wonder what your opinion is. First Amendment versus, copyright is supposed to encourage innovation, for example. So it protects you, who have this great idea for this new technology or app, whatever it is. But on the other hand, it also precludes a bit of innovation, because it means that someone else who may have had a similar idea or one to piggyback on it is sort of stifled a bit in terms of his or her innovative activities. So if you were to discuss or think about the two areas that are impacting on social media, the democratization of media, I would say, as they all relate to net neutrality and the internet and all that, First Amendment protections and guarantees versus copyright law. Do you have any ideas about how copyright law may be changed by this administration or subsequent administrations or reports?
I have no, I wouldn't venture any guesses about what this or future administrations would do. But again, I think that one test is to go back to my newspaper analogy. What is the best analogy in the print world which the Constitution addresses for some of these issues? And you have changed, as you know, not only broadcasters and movie studios, but it certainly changed the music business. And as we get faster speeds and faster, and the ability to download something as large a file, something in as large a file as a movie very quickly, the business models change. A good friend of three of us in this room is heading back to China to teach, where she teaches U.S. law. And she says that in China you can get any movie you want the day it comes out for free. I think as part of its part of China's attempt to not stir up much of the rest of the world, she said that some of those sites are very difficult to get to from the U.S. But in China, she said all of my students see any movie the day it comes out for free. Problematic, of course, how has Hollywood responded? Very simply, release Mission Impossible the same day worldwide. So there's no reason to have somebody go into a movie theater in LA and take the famous shaky picture of the movie, or now to steal the digital video file, which Hollywood is moving toward instead of celluloid. Instead, it's all available worldwide the same day, and it really gives no meaning to your opening weekend. Your opening weekend is worldwide. Similarly with television, again, I can't resist an example from today's paper. The Steven Spielberg science fiction series that's been running on Fox, the most expensive TV series ever produced, they say, probably, maybe, is probably being canceled, but it's very interesting. Everybody made money on that. Fox says it made money on it. Fox Television says it made money on it. Fox, the studio which produced the movie, produced the series for, what did they say, $11 million?
12 million.
12 million. They say they made money on it. How? Because they sold it worldwide, running the same time as in the U.S. So businesses can adapt. I'm not in any way endorsing piracy. I'm just saying that what we went through with Xerox machines and professors I can think of, not looking at with Xerox things from books. See, I'm not looking at Tom. Raise some of the same questions. Authors of books or authors of papers in scientific journals. There's a Xerox machine, which is one reason the Xerox machine was so carefully controlled in the Soviet Union. Jeff?
So Adam,
This is a real role reversal.
you took kind of a dystopian view of what technology may do in terms of free speech and free society. Well, both. And I think what you're saying is something we can all identify with. Your first story was a very poignant one about the Turkish guy who's not able to talk about it. And we've all seen that happen. You even see that happen in a classroom. I'm sure it happened to George Mason. There are things that people suddenly worry, can they even say in the classroom, because who knows who's recording, taking pictures, distributing it all at once. But is there a way in which technology can help to resolve this problem too? Is there any hope at the other end of it, or are we simply going to have to resign ourselves to a world in which somebody famously says, get over it, there's no privacy?
Well, as you know, I'm a techno-optimist. So despite all of the bad examples, there are usually workarounds that technology makes possible. In Yaman's case, what we did was we simply stopped we stopped the streaming for a while. There are countermeasures that you can take that are familiar to at least a couple of people in the room to just any form of surveillance. Some of them are inconvenient, from ranging from not being able to take your phone to China to having to set up. Those of you old enough to remember the Get Smart TV series, or the cone of silence that would descend. There's a digital version of that, so you can have the digital cloud of silence. Very annoying, very not conducive to easy conversation, or certainly to easy meetings in a room this size, but it's possible. So you can say, we're going to have a record, an off-the-record, or Chatham House rules, a conversation. And that's a good example. We actually ran into this in the forums that you've been introducing my video from Los Angeles, except in here, where some people speaking, maybe CEOs or COOs of public broadcasting entities, don't want their remarks to be candid, don't want their remarks reported, or at least attributed to them in any way. So even though the editor-in-chief of the magazine that covers public broadcasting is sitting in the room, he's agreed to take everything, not to attribute anything that has not been explicitly allowed in terms of somebody opting in. And a couple of people, like your successor, Ernie Wilson, the current dean addressing Annenberg, he opted out. He said, I'm off the record completely. And then he had some pretty scathing things to say. That's the sort of pre-technology version. Now, Ernie was somewhat dismayed to learn later that someone from Maryland Public Television actually recorded what he was saying, but the reporter who did that had agreed not to use it. He accidentally, he said, left his machine running. So there are ways around these things, but it requires constant work. So, there were some examples that I could have used from the Middle East, from a certain country which is a strong U.S. supporter, which is one of the more active in exploring different ways of controlling internet content for good, they would say, and for good, some people in the United States would say. But it's similar effort. Jeff. The other Jeff.
The other Jeff. Adam, it does seem, although it's hard to predict exactly, that television and the internet, television, like we, those of us who watch Kukla, Fran, and Ollie know it, and the internet appear to be merging. I didn't hear all the news from Cupertino today, but it's possible more is coming. And that eventually in the home, in the family setting, or in the individual family, individual setting itself, with a tablet or whatever, there will just be one thing that delivers everything. And that content will come to you in basically that format. That the distinction between broadcasting, where, if you will, everybody knows what you're saying, to a kind of a streaming, where perhaps only a few people know what you're saying, or you're doing, or you're showing. Do you see that as something that might, first of all, do you even think that's where we're going? And secondly, do you see that as something with a liberalizing effect? Or because in fact you can do that with audio right now, or something that might have possibilities of even greater control and more danger that autocratic control might take over.
But usually the first thing that happens is liberalization, and then inventors always run ahead of lawmakers and regulators, almost by definition. Interestingly enough, IMSC's chief investigator for audio took a leave of absence from USC last year and is now at Apple. And I had an email exchange with him about some of these things a few days ago. And he basically, no, I shouldn't say that. One can basically say that this is not that much different from where we are now. One thing that's always impressive, I haven't been in a classroom as a teacher since spring of 2010, I guess, when we taught that course together. And even then, way back in 2010, if you ask students, do you watch television? Say, no. What's your favorite program? Oh, Pan Am. Well, you said you don't watch television. Oh, I watch it on Hulu, or I go to, they've already made that transition. Or NPR, do you listen to the radio? Oh, no. But you asked them about a story that was on Morning Edition. I said, oh, yes, of course, you've heard that. And it may have been a file with a friend sent. So what Apple is trying to do is basically, as Apple always does, try to lure you into their walled garden and just be happy with the gospel according to Steve. But the House of Steve, I guess that's what they call it. It's really here. I mean, the idea that what was science, that the supercomputers of the 1970s, that science fiction of the 1950s, the Dick Tracy wrist radio, we've got that, except now it's television also. So that's really gone there. When I was in Singapore, at the National University of Singapore, they had these wonderful business cards, which, of course, all of our business cards get more and more crowded. Theirs include a picture on both sides, of the Chinese and the English side. Well, now they have another line. And gee, there's the URL, there's the email, there's the phone, there's the fax. What's that? Oh, that's our YouTube. Oh, your university's YouTube. No, my individual YouTube. Each individual has a YouTube. A YouTube home. That, Singapore is always very interesting as a glimpse of where things are going.
YouTube what?
They have a YouTube home. There's a YouTube that they've created, a video they've created, and it's on their business card.
Like a channel, like a YouTube channel, it's their own channel.
Right, and it's basically their video introduction of themselves. Here's what I do. Here's some things I'm working on. And look over here on the side, look at some links that you might be interested in following to other YouTubes. So it's, I think something like that is probably what's going to be not enabled, but encouraged by this murder.
So privacy can only be managed. It can't be, it's no longer a reality. It's a journey.
You can do it. You can take the batteries out of your cell phones and all your other devices
And subscribe to reputation.com, right?
Right.
And then monitor your presence on the web and any place else.
It's always very interesting to, students do this all the time, to Google yourself
Yeah.
and see where you're popping up. Of course, on Facebook, they'll let you know when somebody's tagged you in a photo.
Yeah.
It's usually not me, by the way, but that's so that's sort of beyond privacy. Yes.
How encouraged should we be? Well, I like to say it differently. It's either encouraging or discouraging, but given the very nature of the internet and what you said about how when you're doing, even the guy in his apartment, sort of gets found out. How secret can one be? Can a nation be? Can a guy in his apartment be? Can a corporation be? In developing new ways of spying on people, new ways of protecting oneself against spying. I mean, is just the fact that you're working on some internet technique or technology mean that you better be careful almost everybody has access to it?
Yes, so that's the last question. But let me turn around and pose an interesting business question I hadn't thought of until you asked the question. You've worked in a couple of places that are nonprofits that accept donations. Can you make an anonymous donation anymore?
You can check a box that says you want your $10,000 contribution to be anonymous, yeah, but you can't.
Yes, it can be.
But then you couldn't, you really couldn't, unless you went through another person, you could never make an anonymous, you know. Somebody would have to write the check.
That strikes me as a model of what's going on the internet.
I see.
How does one opt out from a drone? They can be equipped with
Tinfoil
license
hat.
plate scanners, facial recognition technology. That anybody can operate one now that they've opened it up. The bill that was rushed through Congress didn't provide any protections for civil rights or civil liberties. A guy who has a restraining order against his ex-wife would have no problems putting up a drone to monitor her everywhere she goes.
But we had an earlier example of exactly that in California, where they had they restricted it somewhat. They used to have license plate data online and pretty open, and somebody who was in fact under an order to stay away from his ex-wife discovered where she lived. He just put in license plate number. And the inventions tend to run faster than the measures to regulate or protect. You're absolutely right.
There doesn't seem to be any measures to regulate or protect in this case, which is all the more disquieting. And one might also ask if it still is a free society when the Attorney General of the United States says that at least one acceptable use of a drone is to kill a citizen.
Yeah, that is, I put in that quote because I think that raises certain problems also.
Can I just add this drone thing? I agree with you. And one thing that scares me is today we think of drones as being a certain size. That's this week. But they're going to be so tiny, you'd never know. They can be watching you. They can be listening to you. They can be anywhere in this version you're talking about. So you've sort of lost the right of privacy in any outside area. I don't know whether they can be inside, but it's a scary phenomenon.
Yeah, small ones are being designed to be deliberately get inside, and they can. Remember the case of the diplomat who was stabbed with an umbrella? Now you don't need the umbrella. You simply have a drone go and deposit a place.
I was on the Hill for a presentation, and one of the congressmen that was working on privacy legislation talked about what he had read online. I think it was Stephen Baker's website about the informati, and said those are the kinds of things that keep us up at night, especially when we're thinking about privacy legislation. And I'm wondering, you know, in the context of science, particularly medical science, maybe some areas, it's maybe a naive question, but like for instance with genetics and cloning, where there are places where generally the profession says, you know, we're just not going to go there. Are we approaching some places with the intersection of technology and the internet and privacy where we will come to points where we just say, you just don't go there?
That is really, the idea that you don't go there, that is really coming apart. I mean, we had it with the recent example of the super disease. Everybody said, okay, let's not publish that we've discovered this, because you know, bad people could then weaponize it. And after a while, well, yes, we're going to publish it for the sake of science, advance of science. But yes, you've really identified an area which is only beginning to go into the general population, the whole area of medicine and bioethics. I mean, day before yesterday, the study comes out showing that computerization of health records may not save money after all. So wait a minute, we've just computerized health records, privacy is almost certainly gone, and we're not going to save money. What happened here? It's like, you know, you've got the retina scan. Wait a minute, what just happened? And in terms of genetics, there's something which I don't think very many people in the room would agree with, but article in the current, I think it's in Nature, that by bioethicists in the UK were arguing that it may become accepted at some point that infants that have babies, they've been delivered, and you then can kill them, which they have some wonderful term for it, post-birth something or other.
Based on the DNA.
Exactly, right. Or that you don't like the color of their eyes, or that they're a girl. We know this goes on in very crude ways now on a very, very large scale. But the idea of being able to know from DNA more about a person that could lead to obviously to the person's non-survival, or later in life to other issues.
I know of a company that's being retracting enormous investments for their technology and their skills and doing institutionalized DNA tracking, and they're planning on contracting with governments. What do you know about this?
I don't, except that
They're attracting mainline investors from this country, from Silicon Valley and other places.
I don't know about that particular example, I don't think, but again, it sounds like something which is not just unexpected, but almost, I hate to say it, almost inevitable. This is all going, I was lucky enough to spend some time with John Markoff in San Francisco when I was there with Jeff in November. And Markoff is certainly one of the better technology writers in the country, let's put it that way. He's been the chief technology reporter for the New York Times for over 20 years, and before that, San Francisco Examiner. He says that the problem now is that things are moving so fast. He's always said that things are moving faster and faster. The pace of change is accelerating. He said things are moving so fast now that no one really knows what's going on. That you're constantly looking back and discovering, oops, this has just happened, or oops, this happened a year ago and is now spread across half of Asia. Sometimes it's good, how many iPads have been sold. But sometimes you wake up and discover, to use her example, you suddenly discover that your expectation of privacy, let alone safety, may no longer be what you thought just walking down the sidewalk.
One of the things that most shatters my techno-optimism is you described the filtering technology that replaces the pages people are trying to access in Tunisia and elsewhere in the Middle East. And then there's the network analysis and filtering that identifies who posts things even when they thought they were anonymous. And as I understand it, it's mostly being sold to them by people who are here, in the United States, who are developing to use on like corporate internets, things like that. So that if you think this is a disturbing trend that's destroying free speech, you're not only having to fight the policy battles, you're also having to fight like the companies in your own country. So how do you think that's a trend that should be stopped, and how would you suggest stopping it?
I would hope that there would be, perhaps hopeless optimistic side of it. I would hope that there would be some shame associated with selling equipment that's going to be used for, certainly for death, for that stops manufacturers.
I said the easy questions for
this is a lot. Having grown up in the 50s on Mad Magazine, I keep thinking of Spy versus Spy. Every time you think you've got something that's really good, great, and along comes the other side, and they figure out some way of turning it to bad. So you've got to race again to catch up, to do something better. There are a couple people in this room who are involved in that right now. It's a little bit like, it's very much like the arms race. You just have to keep going, except that now it is so fast and requires, I think, a level of expertise which unfortunately in the U.S., due to our visa policies and the history of American, domestic American students not choosing to go into a lot of these areas of research. The result is that if you walk around a typical laboratory in the United States looking at some of these questions, you'll find many of the people there are non-U.S. citizens who are going to be forced to go home by our visa policies. And the Chinese and the Indian and the Korean and Singaporean governments are welcoming them with open arms. That, I think, is the real long-term damage that that is being done, and maybe the biggest damage done by the airplanes on 9/11. On that cheerful note, we probably need a drink.
Well, we did, yeah, we just a couple minutes left here, right? Speaking of the national security issues and all that's happened the last decade, lots of expenditure for technology, obviously, in that area. And yet, maybe the most costly part of it, I think you might have said something directly about this, the most costly part of all may be the long lines at the airports that seem to have very small value in terms of actual security. And you gave us the story about, well, there are other ways to do this, and people don't have to wait in lines, and that, if we could bypass it. I think you ended up just on the choice side of that, saying, if you want to pay extra in the United States, you can go on the express line, and they will take a look at your iris or whatever they're looking at there. So what do you want to say? Do we want to take it more towards Singapore, or do you think it's an equilibrium here that we have long lines and then a high price short line, the express lane, or should we be figuring out a better way to do this national security thing at the airport?
First, I thought you were talking about Virginia highways, the new toll. Same principle. I always like the idea of choices. I could have chosen to do something which take actions which would have allowed me to make that connection in San Francisco. I deliberately chose not to. That always strikes me as a good default. That all of one or the other. Basically, you could have most domestic airports, including I think all three here, is no choice. I don't think there is choice here. Clear operated for a while. You could pay how much? Not that much, hundreds. If you traveled a lot, and it saved you a lot of time. You would bypass TSA. But I think that's only working now in Dallas, Atlanta, LA, and only in some airlines.
Right, so that makes it a better question, because you like our default, or you like the Singaporean default?
Oh, I prefer Hong Kong. I prefer being able
Hong Kong on the...
Yeah, being able to opt out, or at least be told. There wasn't even the drop-down menu with the legal language and check here. It was just take off your glasses. The thing is that we are willing to put up with so much what would have been inconceivable with the loss of privacy 20 years ago. We now routinely put up with. Okay, most people, yes.
Not all of us. Even those of us who are 25, not all of us are willing to put up with it.
But to be on social networks and to do e-commerce, in the fall of, not last fall, but it was the fall of 2011. Fall of 2010, at the annual Highway Africa conference. So many people showed up. Summer of 2010. So many people showed up. 800 people showed up. That they had to divide for the first time into tracks. They didn't call them tracks, interest groups. And the organizer, Guy Berger, discovered that there were 40 or 50 people who were bloggers. Highway Africa attracts people literally from Cairo to Cape Town, journalists, technology people. And this year, summer of 2010, there were a group of people, self-described bloggers, And so they created a separate interest group for them, put them in a room about this size, and a guy saw me in the hall, he said, Adam, can you take the bloggers group? What? He said, you take the bloggers group. What do they want? I don't know, but they're in there. So I walked in and asked them where they were from. From Tunisia, Sudan, Egypt, Zimbabwe. I think you're getting the idea. They're all from places that were going to be in the news a short time later. And they were all waiting for my PowerPoint. So I plugged in my computer and went to the USC.edu website, USC.edu/identity, which is the place where you can get all your stationery, letterheads, and business cards. And part of the site gives you the templates for PowerPoints. And so I put up blank PowerPoint slide. This is USC. And I said, here's my PowerPoint. Now let's try to fill it in. What would you like to talk about? And one person raised their hand and said, well, our government doesn't necessarily like the way we are blogging. How can we be more secure? We move around a lot, but the police still seem able to find it. I said, how are you blogging? From smartphones. So, I turned it off, but they still seem to be able to follow it, to take the battery out. Girls, take the battery out, it'll be more difficult. Okay, so put that up, security. Then there are others like electric power, things we take for granted. Like what happens when the power goes out? You only have power 2 hours a day. But last year at Highway Africa, I didn't see anybody from the bloggers group. I didn't see them registration. I didn't see them listed as delegates. They weren't there. I think they're all back running their countries. But it was interesting to meet that group of individuals, having no idea what would be in store in the next 12 months. But helping them with pretty basic questions. And that feeds into my techno options.
If I could just say also, I mean, you for a long time, years back, you were writing about this sort of barrier to entry to journalism through press passes in a country like the United States, and I use the word worse in other countries in terms of barriers. Well, those barriers have just fallen. I mean, bloggers are journalists now, and so you must be optimistic about that. I mean,
well, try to get an NYPD press pass.
Well,
New York.
Yeah, no, you still block certain things, but the point is that the circle of journalism is
Oh, yes, yeah, but
expanded, and it's been
right.
so influential and important in so many parts of the country.
Yeah, I wonder if what Andrew Breitbart would have done
Yeah, that's
20 years ago.
I am, and I know.
But that's become in many countries you still have to register, or you still have to join a government-sanctioned union of journalists from which you can be ejected. So bloggers definitely operate outside the law in many parts of the world.
I like what you just said, and journalists, how do journalists protect their sources? But even more so, how do they protect their search from distortion? Based on basically what you said, people flipping pages depending on where this journalist resides.
Being able to protect sources and protect the act of searching. Really, really interesting. When I was head of news at NPR, we had an example where Nina Totenberg had broken the story. I forget what the story is now, but I forget which government agency subpoenaed the phone records from C&P Telephone, as the local phone company in Washington, and was, to get all numbers dialed from her extension. And NPR went into court to fight it, and ultimately successfully. But really, you talk about a chilling effect. The next best of Nina in those days was Cokie Roberts. She said, "Wait a minute, I mean, I have to go and use Neil Conan's phone now?" I mean, because the phone company has a record of all the calls you were making. Well, now with cell phones, have the record, not only the phone number, but you have the physical locations of where people are on both ends. Through search, an even more telling, I think, even more telling indicator of where your sources are and what you're working on. That is something which is sitting in a cloud and could be subpoenaed. In terms of protecting your sources, I think that's becoming increasingly difficult. And some of that is because of very increasingly aggressive policies on the part of the U.S. government toward leaks. Those of us with memories of Watergate remember the plumbers. They were there to investigate leaks. Well, now, with subpoenas, you can get an awful lot of information about who's doing what.
There were, probably most people can notice there are, I think, 6 prosecutions for espionage against people who were sources for journalists under this administration, only 3 in history before. One of the explanations for that is not just that this government has been very tough on that issue, but also that they can find out now who the sources are. So it's becoming much harder to be a source, just to this point, much harder to be a source for journals today, and this administration isn't helping it. But it's exactly what you're talking about. It's easier now to find out who sources are.
Yeah, the reporter of the year, Western Reporter of the Year in China is the Reuters correspondent in Beijing. And he says Beijing famously doesn't leak. You don't have people running around leaking about their political rivals. But still, he's been able to get a lot of good stories out. And what he does whenever he is working on a story is he makes certain, first he has 4 different cell phones, none of which he uses when he can avoid it. He says, I try to use landlines. Of course, they're tapping that too, but so why make it easy for them? And he tries to deliberately to meet with red herrings, people who aren't his sources. So out of 10 people he meets, 1 will be the source, and he's sort of making life difficult. They can probably figure it out if throw enough effort at it. But that's his description of that reminded me of where we could be heading. That these kinds of precautions are things that we do. I don't carry a smartphone anymore. The battery's not mine. Old BlackBerry. I maintain a lot of files that are not in Word or Excel or any other format that's readily translatable or downloadable. Not because there's anything secret in it. It might make life easy for them. Love it.
Won't you please join me in thanking our distinguished...
Thank you. My audience knows more than I do.
And the reception is downstairs in the main